And we're also going to use that those two demo lectures to accomplish our second goal here, which is to describe benefits of intentionally introducing elements of accessibility into a traditional lecture. And when we get to that point, we'll have plenty of opportunities to exchange some ideas and discuss some of the things that maybe you are already implementing, because most likely you are already doing some of the things that we're going to talk about here today. And our ultimate goal is to be more aware of accessibility principles, make our lectures more effective for everyone. The first learning outcome there, it makes it sound like there's only two ways that a lecture can be fully accessible and non-accessible at all. Of course, in practice, it's always going to be somewhere in the middle, and our goal is to get the closest possible to the more accessible version of that. So for the lecture demo, what I'm going to ask you to do is to play the role of a good note-taking student. And so I'm going to distribute this pages. We're going to start on page 1 here, which is mostly empty. And it has spaces for you to take notes for this lecture that I'm going to demonstrate. And the best way you can is going to be a, again, STEM related, it's a math lecture. But again, try to take notes as if you were a very good note-taking student. Perhaps not even necessarily understanding everything, but you want to take notes because you want to take those notes home and do your studying later. I put a second bullet point here about the language, because that's another thing that I would like you to pay attention to with these demonstrations. The language that I've selected for these demos is carefully picked so that we can have a discussion about that as well. So there's going to be some language there that is a little uncomfortable to hear, but it is meant for the purpose of having a discussion. And all right, so the setting is this. We are in a STEM kind of class where we are analyzing this very complicated natural system, whatever that could be, and it has been reduced to a mathematical equation. And mostly for a non-science major class, perhaps, or perhaps an introductory level science course. And so it's possible that you will be able to solve this problem as soon as you are presented with it. Try not to do that, but rather, again, pretend that you are the student that is taking notes. All right, so I have practiced this a few times. So if you notice something unusual happening, that's okay. Don't, it's part of the presentation. So I'm gonna get started in just a second. I don't know if I can do this without, all right. So here goes our demo. Take 1. So after all that craziness, we've arrived at this equation, which is super simple. This is high school stuff right here. So as you all know, with this kind of equation, what we want to do is isolate the unknown variable, that one, and move all these other things around so we can do some arithmetic. So let's start by moving this number to the other side, which is going to change its sign because it's moving to the other side. So it'd be really dumb to just move it over there and keep the same sign. Moving numbers blindly like that would just show that you don't know how to do algebra. All right, so now we can add these two numbers together, right? And just like that. And all we have to do at this point is divide, right? So, and then we're done. It's a pretty trivial step, that one. So let's do that. Yeah. and divide the entire equation by this number, which is my favorite one, which gives us x equals this fraction. It's going to be just x there because we're dividing that number by the same number, right? Everybody knows that. So they cancel each other out. So the fraction that you see there is something that we can all do in our heads. Using a calculator for this kind of thing would be kind of lame. So the answer is x equals silence. Right. So that's the end of take 1 of this lecture. And I'm going to do the second one. I was going to, and this is just a note, I was going to do the solution here on the screen, but I didn't plan to show it to you anyway. So if you see me doing this kind of thing, imagine that I'm writing, but I will show you all the details in a second. All right, so here comes take 2, same lecture.
We're not seeing anything on the screen. Is that the top point?
Yes.
Okay.
I've practiced this many times. I know exactly what's going on. So same thing, and I ask you to take notes. So you're a very good note-taking student. So if you have something in that take 1 section of the handout, I would like to see what you have. So here goes take 2. Same exact same lecture. So after all that ridiculousness, we have this formula. 5x minus 13 equals 2. This is an equation in which the goal is to find the numerical value of x. And we do that by isolating the x on one side of the formula and moving all the numbers to the other side. So let's move the negative 13 number from the left to the right. In the process, the sign changes, so it becomes positive 13 on the right side. The reason that happens is because we're actually adding 13 to both sides of the equation. And so positive 13 cancels the negative 13 on the left, and it appears as a positive 13 on the right. So now, on the right, we have 2 plus 13, which is equal to 15. So let's rewrite our equation as 5x equals 15. And then, since we're interested in isolating the x, we need to do one more thing, which is to divide both sides of the equation by 5. And when we do that, we get 5x divided by 5 on the left, which leaves us with just x there, because the 5's cancel each other out, and 15 divided by 5 on the right. We can find out what that fraction is using a calculator, but with enough practice, and with enough practice, you can do it in your head too, which is kind of cool. So the answer is x equals 3. Good, thank you. All right, so that was the second version of that lecture. And let's go back to this. All right, so I'm showing here what I was writing at the same time as I was describing this solution of the equation. And it looks the same, both of those. However, you were only able to follow one of those two. Okay. Now, let's go to our next step, which is going to be a little discussion here. So one of these lectures was accessible or more accessible than the other one. And I have 2 questions that we're going to discuss here. First one is, which one was the more accessible version? But more importantly, what made it accessible? What do you think that made that second version more accessible? And equally important, who benefits from this kind of mode of lecturing? Is our second question. So I'm going to distribute this other handout because that has the script. I actually read out of the script while I was demonstrating these lectures. That could be helpful as we answer these 2 questions. So let's take let's say about 5 minutes or so for you to and answer these questions maybe in those pages that I just gave you. And feel free to discuss with people around you what you find, and then we'll just all together talk about it. So.
There's my notes. For the first one and the second one.
Don't be shy, you can move together.
What was it?
Giving them a few minutes to just read through the documents, but yes.
It's your favorite number 5?
It is.
Well, and you know, there were other things we were cringe. Quite frankly, while I was doing the second one, I was thinking of writing, and I was thinking, even if you were writing on the board, I'm not sure I did what you did first one. Right? Because I'm doing fine just writing based on what they say. That way, you know, I don't have that. Speaking of my physics class, you know, I have to do little demonstrations like doing. As soon as I started doing the phenomenon work, it became much more confusing. They can't see what I do. So I do this kind of verbal description of what I'm doing, right? Which now, as I'm sitting here listening to that, I'm going. The other thing that does is it highlights for students in the room what exactly I want them to pay attention to. Right? You know, and actually, my description is more or less specific based on whether how much I want them to notice just on their own versus how much I really do want them to focus on this one little aspect of what's going on.
All right, so I'm hearing some really excellent discussion going around, and just give you a few more minutes to continue talking about this. But I'm hearing a lot about the description part, the descriptive nature of the second one, and if you haven't discussed this yet in your groups, there's something also about the language employed in those lectures that you might want to have a conversation with your group. So let's do a couple more minutes, and then we'll continue. A couple more minutes, and maybe concentrate this time on that, specifically the language. The recording is it's empty. Yeah, it's just, the power is up. So
How much man? Sure. I can walk in and say, well, I expect them to come watch that. And if I do that, it's not a very expensive thing because yes, that's not reasonable, right? And so I think that gets to kind of here. And there's a difference between I would take all those things that are confusing. Just say, oh, yes, you go. Yeah.
Read into number 2 more descriptive.
Brian keeps saying, as you know, as you they're not, but I know. What you're really saying is, if you don't know this, you're out of line.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, reading it as you can follow. Yeah, following along.
Yeah, I guess I feel like you had to.
Which of all that stuff? Which of all that stuff? Did you actually understand?
all right, then let's share now the things that you have been discussing there in your groups. Whoever wants to start. The first one. Which one was the accessible version? You have a question, go ahead. Or
well, just the first one, laying aside all the other problems with it, this constant subtext of how dumb you guys are was not only bad manners, but it was distracting. It was getting in the way of understanding the concept.
all right, interesting point. How can we? I'm gonna try to make some notes here. How would you like summarize that in just a couple of words, 3 words? Distracting.
Distracting metacognitive subcontext. It means personally sort of, their id is sort of popping through into the lecture.
Okay. I don't know how to type that word, but I will do it in a second. Yes.
And if I can add to that point that you made, the language and the wording is certainly distracting, is insulting. It's also very ableist. If we can have a conversation about that, because the words that are being used are denigrating people with disabilities of different types, right? We've got craziness, which is stigmatizing mental illness. We've got the word lame, which is negative connotation for people with physical mobility issues. We've got dumb. We've got these words that are very loaded in terms of people with disabilities. And so that is being imbued within that lesson. So first of all, it is distracting and insulting, but it's also also tremendously problematic.
Can someone, thank you for that comment. So can someone tell us what the words that in that context are considered ableist? For example, some of the words that are the ableist words in that.
High school stuff.
High school stuff, I heard. Okay.
Crazy. Find out.
All right. So there's some examples of words that were used in that in one of these versions of the lecture. And if you notice, they were so part of it is the word itself, but also the context in which these words are expressed is in that version of the lecture has always been a negative connotation to it. All right. So, so we're talking about the things that the ableist language is what makes it non-accessible. So avoiding those types of expressions would make a lecture more accessible. And then what was the other thing about that first, the accessible version of the lecture that made it accessible in addition to the language?
The fact that we're very descriptive of exactly what you're doing rather than general.
The opposite of using descriptive language was to use things like what? Expressions like what?
This number, yeah, my favorite number.
This is my favorite number.
This fraction.
This number, my favorite number, here, there, from here to there, those types of expressions, which are not descriptive enough. Whereas that would be avoiding, again, those things, right? So the descriptive language sounded more like, give me one example of that. Descriptive.
Yeah, isolate X.
Isolate X, all right. Something else?
Move the negative number from the left to the right, left to the right.
Move from left to right, for example. Another example of that? Somebody picked up
To add 13 to both sides.
at 13. Okay. So being very explicit about what we're doing, perhaps on the screen or on the board, but also being very descriptive. So that it's going to be, that kind of mode of lecturing is actually very beneficial to many students. I have a comment.
I think it was good too, that in the very beginning you stated your goal.
Oh, goal was stated from the beginning.
So the student knows, you know, where they're headed.
Correct. Thank you.
You also noticed in the second one you gave us a reason, in the first one you just told us.
Goal stated from the beginning, provides reasons for why each step is done.
So Vaughn, if I can assume that this was in like a science class versus a math class, the other thing that you did was the way you described what you were doing mirrored what they hear in math classes.
I see. So some consistency perhaps with what they might be seeing in other classes at the same level for those students. That's another thing to consider. All right, so who benefits from the accessible version of the lecture? Let's make a list.
Everyone,
Spoiler alert, the answer is everyone, but let's make a list. Students, specifically what kind of student or what kind of situation in which a student finds themselves in.
well, clearly, if the student can't see the board that day, right? You know, if they left their glasses at home or if they broke, right? I could have followed along without my glasses.
Let's make a list.
So someone who has any kind of visual.
Any other kind of visual impairment or disability. Okay, who else?
Students watching the Panopto from home.
Watching it on video. Okay. Someone is watching this on video later at home from a Panopto recording, for example. If we're not recording ourselves doing all these motions, even sighted students would have trouble with this mode of lecturing. There's more.
Students that can't remember algebra but are embarrassed to say so.
Okay. Can't remember all the details or all the prereq knowledge required. So it's good to remind them of all those things by being explicit. Okay. There's more. There's more examples here I'm sure we can think of. Kind of related to the first two, we're talking about students who have a disability, but there might be another example related to that. Yeah.
What about for anybody doing any type of auditing or accreditation where they want to see the lecture, they want to know maybe you can use it as a like proof of like evidence of teaching, and sometimes if you're having your pedagogy examined
Okay.
by a supervisor, maybe not so much at this level at the university, but if you were like K-12 or you're submitting a lesson plan for evaluation somewhere, you can actually show that this is what I'm saying, down to the literally what the lesson will be.
Okay. So just more general
Assessment. That's the word.
assessment. Yes.
I think students who are auditory learners are going to really benefit from that specifically. So not just if they have a visual disability, but also if they just tend to learn better by hearing it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Great. Auditory learners. A couple quarters ago, I had a student who sat in the back and was always doing this on the back. And never asked, but there could be other situations like perhaps they forgot their glasses at home, or perhaps they can't afford glasses.
Mm.
And they still want to be in our classroom. And they deserve to be in our classroom. So there are many more situations in which this more accessible mode of lecturing, being very descriptive and avoiding ableist language, is beneficial. So we're going to move on now to an even more accessible version of that. This will be take 3. And there is no one unique solution to the how do I make my lecture more accessible or fully accessible. There's always different little things that you can add to a lecture and the delivery of that lecture to make it more accessible. And so this is just another example of how we could do that same lecture, one which includes a description of the entire process in words and a picture version of that. That thing on the right is actually a picture. It was built in math type, but then it was turned into a picture that has an alternative text that says descriptive. And so that doesn't necessarily have to be a readable, machine readable equation set there in order for this to be accessible as well, if you have the description on the side. So sometimes we think that we have to do all of this many different things to make our lecture fully accessible. but that's not always the case. You can always add little pieces here and there. And so this was done with math type, but this could also be a screenshot of the blackboard or the whiteboard that you did. And you will be okay for accessibility purposes because you have the entire description there on the side as well. Yes.
Do you have an opinion on having the example either built into a presentation at the ready or walking through it in real time on the board? Do you personally have an opinion on it?
Personally, I like to go step by step and do the writing as I showed it in the first couple of cases. And so one might be worried then that because we're doing it by hand and it becomes basically a picture, then that's not very accessible. But then if you add these other elements, the descriptive language and all that, then it makes it more accessible. So again, there's no one unique way of making it fully accessible. It's just more accessible the more we think about it. So the more intentional we are about doing those, introducing those elements into our lectures. Did you have a question, Rebecca?
Oh, I was just, yeah, I think I was going the same way you were. I really liked your take to pedagogically. You know, my concern with this is while it might be very, very accessible, it doesn't require any thought process from the student, where when I was following along with you, I was thinking about the steps, and you could really do a lot more with pausing and asking the students what step to do next, whereas this is almost like you've shown them the puzzle answer before they even have looked at the puzzle. So I understand you were showing it for demonstration of accessibility though, rather than pedagogy.
Yeah. So different options, different options to do.
The tag on that though, if you walk them through the process, it's like two, and then put this, well, not that, but put the other one up for them to sort of summarize it, then that could be a way of doing that too.
Great. So I have a few other things to consider list here. I'm just going to share some of the things that I do, again, intentionally in my lectures. And if you have any additional things that are not here, I want to share with everybody here, please go ahead. So I'm going to start just with the list here. The reducing background noise is important. And I know I've not done that a few times in my classes where I leave the door open and you can hear everybody from the outside. To have a classroom setting where the background noise is pretty homogeneous, very predictable, is good practice. The use of a microphone is also good practice, particularly for very big classrooms. If many of us record our lectures using Panopto, for example, and a very important thing to do there, which I've actually not been modeling in this session, because sometimes you just get into the into the flow of things and you forget to do some of these things. So that, in a way, also demonstrates what we're talking about here. There is no unique, perfect way of doing it. We will make these mistakes sometimes. So repeat the questions if you're doing recordings, particularly in your classroom. If a student asks a question, it's always a good idea to repeat the question before answering for the recording purposes. Not just for the recording purposes, actually, because there might be some students who will need you to make that question clear. Some of us who do things like pointing and showing things on the screen and indicate or highlighting certain features on the screen, it would be best practice to do it on the computer so that it gets recorded as well. I use Pointer a lot, but then I realized that that might be a problem for a student who is watching the lecture later. And so I've started just using the little arrow there on the screen. Yes?
So I like to use the dock camera because there's a lot of times when I need to get my hands in and show them how to twist and turn and everything like that. Sure. Are there any accessibility issues that I should be at least aware of when I make that decision as opposed to using the computer? Is it pretty equivalent to just got my hands in?
Yeah. Do they get recorded? All
so
of that
basically, you can use there's a software on our computers called Sphere, and if you run Sphere, it basically picks up whatever image is going through the whatever you're projecting is basically, so it's basically a screen on there, So you just open Sphere and then you open Pinocchio and you can lecture capture straight off the document. Yeah, so that's what I do.
Awesome. Yeah.
I'd be happy
So
to
for those modes of instruction, which I do a lot too for physics, we have to solve problems all the time and do diagrams and things like that. So I try to, again, be very explicit with the language. Very descriptive language kind of takes care of some of that. And so that still allows us to do what we are very comfortable doing, but also we can go a little bit beyond that. We can try, yeah.
I noticed that the presentation is the PowerPoint is in black and white. Is that a best practice? Using black and white versus any, I know there's varying degrees of templates that can go, you know, pink and purple and all kinds of things like that. But even in some of the templates that are still have high contrast but are not as plain as black and white, are those still accessible to people with anyone with low vision or anyone that is trying to use any type of technology to read the text for them, or is black and white the best option?
I personally, I always go black and white because that's the default, and there are many tools that can check the contrast of your slides, and actually Canvas, the Ally tool, checks for contrast as well. And black and white is the safest. It never gives me any warnings.
Printing slides, it's gonna save you money.
Yeah.
Sure. Printing at home.
Yes.
PowerPoint will actually do that as well. You can do an accessibility check and
Oh.
it'll tell you if your photos have alt text or not, and if
Right.
the color contrast is not something that's legible. So you can actually do it right in your PowerPoint.
Excellent. Yeah. And I have something else to say about PowerPoint in a minute later when we talk about the final things. Additional resources. A few other things, if we teach very technical terms and there are some symbols there that might be defined. In physics, there is a lot of Greek letters, and I thought everybody knew that, you know, the alphas, betas, and gammas, and they don't. So it's always good to say it, or at least I do that. I say it, I write it, and I explicitly write how you spell all of those Greek letters, for example. And something particularly for people like me. I'm an international person. I have an accent sometimes. I say words in a funny way. So technical terms, it's good to write it down because the way I say it is perhaps not the way they hear it in other classes. And so that's another accessibility thing that helps everybody. All right. And I have a few more things here. Reevaluate attendance requirements. Some students are sometimes not able to be here all the time or be here on time for a class. Perhaps think about increasing flexibility in some of our either assignments or, again, attendance policies that we might have. And the final one there is something that I started doing last quarter, and I just wanted to share it. I'm not exactly sure if this is a great idea or not, but so as instructors, we get these accommodation letters from Access Services. And these letters tell us what the accommodations the students have. So one of the most common ones that I get is that student needs we have to give them twice the amount of time to take quizzes and exams and things like that. And in particular, for an online class, that comes in an email format, and that's it. And it's an email that is sent to the student and to the instructors of that student for that quarter. And I'm not sure if we still do this, but in a face-to-face class, I remember they gave the letter to us in person. I don't know if that's still the case. I think it's not the case anymore, but when it was the case, that moment of exchange was an opportunity for us to say, all right, got it, we're good. Whereas in an online format, or when it comes in an email format now, I feel like the students perhaps don't get that reassurance that we are going to do something about that, or that we are going to take care of those accommodations, because at that point it becomes our job. In particular for an online class, when there might be quizzes with time limits and whatnot. And so a couple quarters ago, I started replying to those emails to the student saying, all right, got the letter, it's all good, I'll take care of it. So not replying in a way as saying, oh, let me know if I can do something, because that puts, again, the pressure on them, and they already went through all the the trouble of getting that accommodation letter. We don't want to put that pressure on them again, or at least that's what I think. So my responses here are just to say, all right, I got the letter, it's all good. And the reason I'm sharing this with you is because, with one exception, every time I've done that, I've received a response back from the student. Thank you for saying. That was it. So, so I think that's something that they perhaps need to hear as well. Be careful. Yeah.
If we have the time, can we actually go back a bullet point? And I'd love to hear some insight. I teach 2 hybrid courses. Attendance is really important and also pretty spotty. And so I would love to hear some thoughts on reevaluating the attendance requirement.
All right. Some thoughts from me
or from
everybody.
Yeah, yeah.
So I can say some things about just personal experience from the classes that I have taught. At least a couple of times, I've had situations at the very beginning of the quarter where, let's say, we have a quiz on the 3rd day or something like that, and the student doesn't show up. And so my syllabus says no late work, no makeup quizzes, etc., etc. So that student should get a 0. But then the student communicates with me maybe the day after, a couple days later, saying that they had some troubles and they couldn't make it. In some cases, they tell me all the details, but sometimes they just say, oh, I had an issue today, you can come to the quiz, can I take it 2 days from now? And in a couple of cases, when I allow that to happen, those ended up being some of the best students I've ever had in class. And so I just think to myself, what would have happened if I had said no? There's no way, no. The policy is no late quizzes, no makeup quizzes. That's it, you get a 0. Because the syllabus says so. And I do know from personal experience that at least in one of these cases, it was an accessibility issue that only became official later. So from personal experience, I just know that I would be okay, let's say, with someone taking advantage of that flexibility than denying someone who is really, really trying, and denying them from staying with the class and with us. So I don't know if somebody else has any other thoughts about that. Rebecca.
Yeah, so I mean, I think over time, having taught 20 years, what I allow, and I think a lot of times I've got the flexibility built into the syllabus at this point, so that what I don't like is having to hear from one student why they should get something special and somebody else why they should get something special. And if I just say, you know what, your lowest test is dropped, then when you have to miss that test, then that's your lowest test, and it's dropped, And like you're saying about other accessibility things, that way it actually works well for everybody, because sometimes everybody has a bad day, right? And then so a lot of times if you can have that flexibility, I found then that it most of the time it takes care of itself. But I don't know if that's the case for everybody.
Well, and I think that those of us who use the Panauto,
yes,
one of our driving forces is to address these very issues that our students are not me when I was a student, who had no responsibility. And so life happens to them a lot more than it ever happened to me as a student. And by using things like Panauto, it allows those students who miss an entire week just because life happened to them, they actually have a chance to finish the class and be successful. And I know almost every quarter I have a student, I can identify. They finish this class because we're doing those things. And then there are all the other students who use that for other reasons that helps them to be successful.
So I think in the STEM area, we were early adopters of Panopto as predecessors way before, but the number of ways, so that's just the lecture capture, right? So we thought at the same time, well, it'll be just nice for the students to go back. The different ways students have told me that they've used that. International students have said that they have listened to me at half speed, slowed down, and it's helped their English. Somebody told me they listened to it while working out every day, and that was just like a review or refresher. I've had people with childcare issues. I've had people with sicknesses. We've had other faculty that have been sick, and they've gone back, and we've just shown the students the Panopto lectures until they came. The snow days. I've had adjunct faculty watch my Panoptos when they're teaching a class. I taught Physics 114 last quarter, and I watched Yvonne's Panoptos to see how he explained this. So, like you're saying about sometimes these things that start off as accommodation ideas, they're great for everybody. Just start to go in all of these ways. It's wonderful to think about like the capture that.
Yeah, thanks. And thank you for bringing up also that point of the drop lowest grades rules. I think that's becoming more and more popular. And that is actually a really great practice in terms of accessibility. Yeah.
One thing that's not mentioned here that I'm sure you do, but also consider whether a lecture is the best way to communicate that particular concept. I think that to some degree you've gone a little overboard of trying to chase lecture out of the classroom, but it's still a good point that it's not the only tool available. And by the way, the last time they surveyed faculty, they found out that 60 to 80% of faculty, and this cuts across all disciplines, are still depending on lecture as a primary tool for instruction. And in many cases, that may not be the appropriate tool to use. And so that's another thing to consider even before we start talking about the accessibilities. Is lecture the best tool for this particular lesson in which to communicate?
Yeah, thank you. All right, so I have a few more slides and very little time. I wanted us to have some time to practice, but this was a great discussion. So I do have so I wrote a little script for the description of this graph. So again, this same related kind of thing. And there was a goal with that description, and the script for that is in one of the pages that I distributed. So if you want homework for tonight, you can look at that script and rewrite what this would look like in a more accessible version. So the script that is available there for this particular slide is a very non-accessible version of it. But we're gonna skip that just for the interest of time, and I just want to share this with you because sometimes I personally need some inspiration to do this work, because sometimes it gets a little tedious and time consuming. It's for a very good reason, but sometimes it gets a little, takes a lot of time. And so I like to find examples of where this kind of work is, you see the positive impact of doing this kind of work. So there is a really amazing TED Talk by Dr. Wanda Diaz-Merced. So I'm an astronomer, so this is an example from astronomy that I wanted to share with you. As an astrophysicist studying magnetism in supernovae and supernova explosions, and she got her PhD and then became blind after that. And so the way she describes that transition in that TED Talk is really powerful. She used the word excommunicated, like she felt excommunicated from the field of astronomy because she couldn't do it anymore. Like all this effort that she put throughout the years, get her PhD, and then all of a sudden she's not allowed to do astronomy anymore. And so she developed a technique of using sound to analyze graphs like the one in the picture in this slide. In the presentation here, in that TED Talk, she explains her efforts of trying to bring this methods into different places, different universities. And so essentially requesting funding to further develop these ideas of using sound to investigate astronomical data. And she would say then that when she went to universities with these ideas, universities would say, why should we do this? There are no blind astronomers who need this. And that was the response that she would get from basically all of the places she went to. And so let's just think about that for a second, that kind of response. But one of the things that she also talks about in this presentation is that she actually made a really cool discovery using that sonified version of the data, which sighted astronomers missed. Because sighted astronomers were looking at the graph, they were looking at the big spike in the graph, and then thinking that everything else in that data set was that astronomers actually literally call that noise. It's just noise in the data, random data that goes up and down without any significant information in there. But in the sonified version of that data, there is actually a pattern in there, which she discovered with that process. And so I think that this is an excellent example of how this work in accessibility leads to a benefit to your field, whatever that field that you're so passionate about is. In my case, this is astronomy. So I highly recommend you to take a look at that that presentation. It's a 10, 12-minute TED Talk, and it's just amazing. So I will end with a list here of resources for further information on accessibility. So the accessibility series at DCC, we're trying to have at least 1 or 2 of this every quarter. A few quarters ago, I did the Microsoft Word fundamentals, and there is a Panopto recording of that. I can share this presentation with anyone who is interested so that you can get to the links there. We had a accessible email session running parallel to this. And they did that a few weeks ago, and I went there. And we learned a lot more than just doing accessible email. So any of this accessibility series expand way beyond what the title seems to imply. So if you have a chance to attend one of those, please do, because it's not just about that thing, it's about many other things we're going to discuss. And I'm interested in doing something about PowerPoint because many of us use PowerPoint, so probably next quarter. The State Board Community and Technical Colleges has a really amazing Accessibility 101 Canvas page, which is open. You can see all the content there. And then there's a specific STEM-centric version of that. And then just recently, as in a few days ago, they published this micro course version of that Access 101, 3 hours each for specific sections of it. And then finally, as I said, when we have this accessibility series workshops or meetings here on campus, we usually have a combination of people from these places here on campus, from access services, from the library, from e-learning. So we are all collaborating on this. So if you have any questions about accessibility, you can go and contact any people in those teams. So I think I will leave it at that. Thank you again for being here.
If you can please fill out these, I'll collect them on your way out.